The test is in 4-part, Part 1, Part 2, Part 3, and Part 4. Now look at Part 1.
Part 1.
What have you been up to?
I've just been to a tutorial. Weren't you two supposed to attend?
Yes, we were.
First, you have some time to look at questions 1 to 4. Now we shall begin. You should answer the questions as you listen, because you will not hear the recording a second time. Listen carefully and answer questions 1 to 4.
Hi there, Sang-min. What have you been up to?
I've just been to a tutorial. Weren't you two supposed to attend?
Yes, we were. But I had an essay to finish and Julianne offered to help.
Did we miss much?
Well, I thought it was quite interesting. It was all about spending habits among undergraduates. It was based on recent research done by a PhD student studying behavioral psychology.
Oh, yes. I remember being interviewed by him about what I usually spend my money on.
And what did you say?
Well, most of my money, probably around 75%, goes on basic living, paying rent, food costs, and of course, university fees.
I'm the same, except my food bill is higher.
We are all in the same boat here. Virtually all my money goes on that too, but I also spend a lot of money on textbooks, between 100 and 120 pounds a month, usually more. Realistically, it's closer to 150 pounds.
That explains why you get such good marks. Another aspect of the interview was students' use of credit cards, with a particular focus on how students manage these.
In my case, not very well. I always end up spending more than I plan to. It's too easy to use.
Surely that must be the point, that students are given credit cards too easily before they've learned how to use them. And the number of credit cards some students get, it's frightening. The average is about 3 cards.
Not only cards. Students need to learn how to manage money too. And this is what the interviews meant to find out. By comparing and contrasting all the data, the root causes of student spending could be highlighted.
And the effects this has on students, I'd imagine, would be more negative than positive.
Perhaps, but this was the other part of what the student was trying to achieve. You also need to study the effects to find answers.
Before you hear the rest of the conversation, you have some time to look at questions 5 to 10. Now listen and answer questions 5 to 10.
But I think it all goes back to how we were taught to manage money when we were children.
That's true. Our behavior now is closely related to the childhood environment and what we learned from that.
But how far back should we go? When do children really begin forming an understanding of what money means?
I've read that children between 3 and 5 can understand what's right and wrong. That's when they can learn concepts like sharing. At the age of 6, most children can understand the value of money.
This suggests that if parents offered practical advice to their children at an early age, it could have a very positive impact on their spending habits in later life.
It basically comes down to 3 areas. The first one is allowance, Parents should not try to focus on how much money they give their children, but rather on what they need.
Needs are difficult to define, so parents need to resist the urge to give in when their children say, I want.
For me, the only way to teach children the difference between needs and wants is to give them a practical allowance. If my parents had not done that for me when I was younger, I don't think I would be able to handle the money they give me now.
True. The second thing I think is important is saving.
Can you explain a bit more?
Well, basically, parents need to introduce their children to personal finance. If we are expected to deal with money now, then we have to learn when we're younger.
I see what you mean. And it could be in quite simple ways, like by helping them to open their own savings account.
There's one more area I think is vital.
What's that?
It's buying. We spend excessively on credit cards because we don't know how to control money. We almost need to learn how and what to buy, which is why parents should allow their children to participate in this. If they want something expensive, like a new pair of trainers, then they could be encouraged to save a bit of their allowance.
And parents could also promise to help by saying that they will pay the rest if the child, at the end of their period of saving, still does not have enough.
That is the end of part 1.
You now have half a minute to check your answers.
Now turns to part 2.
Part 2.
You will hear Elliot, an environmental science student, talking to his tutor about an essay he is writing on captive breeding programs.
First, you have some time to look at questions 11 to 15. Now, listen carefully and answer questions 11 to 15.
Dr. Ran?
Oh, come in, Elliot. Thanks for sending me the draft of your extended essay. Now, you're writing about captive breeding of endangered species, aren't you?
Yes.
Okay. Well, this isn't a bad first draft, but there are some issues I think we need to discuss.
Yes. I wasn't sure if I'd done enough research before I started writing.
I'd say you've got plenty here. Too much in places. You've got this very long introduction on factors threatening the survival of species now and in the future, for instance. It's interesting, but it doesn't address the main issue of this essay.
Oh, I thought I needed to give supporting evidence for my ideas.
Yes, but only for key ideas. You can't cover everything. You've got to focus on the area you've chosen, which is the breeding of endangered species in captivity. Now, you have lots of relevant material about that, but I think you need to look at the planning of your central section again. At present, it's all rather a jumble.
Oh, you mean I need to write it all out again?
Well, it's just a matter of moving the things round a bit. Your introduction needs a rethink, as I said. Why don't you just begin by saying what captive breeding is?
Give a definition.
That's right. Then you should make it clear which are positive points and which are negative ones. For example, you start with the fact that breeding endangered species in captivity may be the only way we have of preserving some from extinction in the years to come, which is clearly an advantage. Now, what other advantages did you mention?
Well, the whole thing about zoos, that since they're the obvious places for captive breeding to take place, this could justify their role in the future. They're not just a place for people to go and stare at animals for fun. And then there's the point that captive breeding eventually allows the animals to be reintroduced to the wild again, in theory at least.
Right. So, put those points together. Then the disadvantages.
Well, the point that these programs are very expensive, obviously. Then thinking about the animals themselves, the psychological effects of captivity.
Yes. And you also had a good section on the problem of disease for animals in captivity. But maybe you could have mentioned the poor success rate when they are eventually reintroduced into the wild.
Right.
Before you hear the rest of the talk, you have some time to look at questions 16 to 20. Now listen and answer questions 16 to 20.
Now, your next section's on requirements for successful release of these animals into the wild. I think you need some evaluation here. Which of these requirements are more important and which are less important, according to the available data?
I had some information about that, but I wasn't sure if I needed to put it in.
Yes, definitely.
My first point, for example, that's to do with the fact that animals bred in captivity have to be taught how to survive before they're released. All the data shows that's absolutely essential. Unfortunately, if they're just released without training, they won't know how to hunt and how to avoid predators and so on. Some articles suggest that it's necessary, actually, to provide food and shelter for the animals after they've been released, at least for the first few months. But the research suggests that this is less crucial to the successful reintegration of the animals.
Right. You also mentioned the idea of providing employment for local people in the areas where the animals were being re-released, and education, so that they'll see the return of the animals into their habitats as a positive thing.
Yes, that sounds important to me, but I couldn't actually find any statistics or information about it. And I'd have thought it was really important to screen the animals to be sure they were healthy before they were returned to the wild. But the figures show that actually it doesn't make much difference.
That's surprising, yes. Did you get any data on the effects of acclimatization?
Yes, it showed that if animals are kept on the site where they were to be released for a time in order to acclimatize, they have a far better survival rate than those released directly into the wild.
Okay. Well, you've got some good information there. Have you thought at all about your final section?
Well, I think I'll be looking at the whole question of habitat protection and whether in fact captive breeding is the answer, or whether we can protect endangered species within their natural habitat.
That sounds fine. So, I think if you go away and make those changes, that sounds quite promising.
Thank you.
That is the end of part 2.
You now have half a minute to check your answers.
Now turns to part 3. Part 3.
You will hear an interview with Dr. Simons.
First, you have some time to look at questions 21 to 24. Now, listen carefully and answer questions 21 to 24.
Well, as I said, there were 3 areas of interest, so perhaps we should take each in turn.
Fine. Let's take the medical and physical evidence first.
Well, first of all, life expectancy. Although some very old individuals were encountered, the Ramesses is a case in point. He was probably over 90. It seemed the average Egyptian died rather young, from about 30 to 35 years old, on the whole. Although the nobility, as might be expected, tended to live longer. Some of them have been found to be 50 or 60 years old. Well, naturally, the older they got, the more medical problems were encountered. But some modern disorders have so far not been found. There is no evidence yet of any malignant tumours, for example, although the fact that most people studied were comparatively young could account for this. Another modern problem, dental decay, was also absent, probably due to the plain diet and absence of sugar. There was another problem with teeth caused by this diet. The stones on which their flour was ground caused a lot of grit to get into the bread, and this eroded the teeth, so much that many older people must have suffered greatly and could have been confined to a liquid diet. An abscess on the jaw caused by this kind of erosion may in fact have contributed to the death of Ramesses II. Analysis of the internal organs of several mummies has revealed that intestinal parasites were common, even among the upper classes. Evidence of a generally low standard of public hygiene and another widespread disorder was a form of anemia. Naturally, the ancient Egyptians didn't smoke, but lesions on the lung were widespread. These, however, are the sort that we associate today with workers in mines and quarries, and must be due, in the case of Egyptians, to living in sandy desert conditions. Actually, on the smoking issue, there was a temporary sensation when traces of what appeared to be tobacco were found in Ramesses' sarcophagus, but botanists later confirmed that it was not in fact tobacco itself, but a related plant which is native to Egypt. In the meantime, cynics were commenting that it probably had come from the cigarette of some careless Egyptologist or museum attendant of the past.
Ha ha! And what about their physical appearance?
Before you hear the rest of the talk, you have some time to look at questions 25 to 30. Now listen and answer questions 25 to 30.
Well, what would you expect from seeing Egyptian art? They were light and slight in build. The average height for both men and women was about 1.60 meters, and studies of the skeletons from which the covering of flesh can be extrapolated suggest that they weighed much less in relation to their height than most modern people. From about 10 to 15 kilograms, less than someone of a similar height today is the estimate.
And what about mummification?
Well, the first thing to be said is that it wasn't always done in the same way, and it was by no means infallible, as many people tend to think. Many bodies, including that of the famous King Tutankhamun, were also entirely destroyed by overuse of one or another of the substances generally employed. The basic procedure was much the same, however. Most of the internal organs, including the brain, were removed and preserved separately in a jar. The brain was got out through the nose using a sort of hook.
Oh dear.
Yes, it used to be thought that the heart was always removed too, but in the case of Ramesses it was found in place. The body was then immersed in a substance called natron. That's a form of sodium carbonate, which occurred naturally in Egypt, for 40 to 70 days. It was then washed, made up and wrapped in linen bandages and placed in its coffin or sarcophagus. Then it was soaked in oils, resins and perfumes to help preserve it further.
You said the body was made up. Do you mean its face was painted?
Yes. Ramesses was not only made up, they had to restructure his nose, which was damaged when they took out his brain. The investigators found that it had been stuffed with small animal bones and peppercorns of all things. His hair had been dyed too.
You said that Ramesses had suffered other adventures after his death?
Ah, well, yes. Poor chap. Well, for a start, he was found in a much later tomb than his real date. Along with a lot of other pharaohs, it looks very much as if the priests of later times had moved and reburied him to save him from tomb robbers. His body was transported, along with the other pharaohs found in the same tomb, to the Cairo Museum. That was in 1871, and it was put on display. Well, naturally, removed from the dry desert atmosphere, his body started to deteriorate, and by the 1970s was in very poor state. That was part of the reason why the Egyptian authorities gave their consent for its temporary removal to Paris for study, yet another upheaval. The French experts aimed not only to carry out an investigation, but were also able to apply the latest techniques of restoration and conservation, so that at the end of the study, Ramesses was specially treated and then rewrapped in new bandages. Well, they weren't exactly new, since they were of ancient Egyptian date, given a new sarcophagus and carefully transported back to Cairo, where he is now kept in a controlled environment, which should slow down the deterioration process.
So, as I said at the beginning, not only was science served, but a proper respect was paid to the remains in the end.
Exactly.
That is the end of part 3.
You now have half a minute to check your answers.
Now turns to part 4.
Part 4.
Listen to the conversation between Andrew and Samantha. Complete the summary by writing one suitable word in the numbered spaces.
First, you have some time to look at questions 31 to 40. Now, listen carefully and answer questions 31 to 40.
Does your work bring you into contact with many overseas students, Samantha?
Occasionally. As you know, a solicitor's work is to advise people about their rights when they have any problems understanding how the law operates. They may need help because of injury to themselves or their property, if they've been attacked or robbed, for example. But these are not by any means the main problems I deal with.
Really? We know more about crime, I suppose, because we read about it in the newspaper or see it on TV. What other things do people come to you for help with?
There are lots of things which don't get nearly so much attention. Sometimes it's to do with relationships in the community, as when bills aren't paid, or contracted work isn't completed, or neighbours disagree. At other times, it's to do with people not understanding the law and their responsibilities, and this is probably where overseas students have the most difficulty. One interesting example is customs laws, something which every new arrival has to come up against.
What is it that overseas students find most difficult to understand about Australian customs regulations?
I think it's a shock to many people arriving here for the first time to find out how many things are prohibited. Everyday food items, for example. I mean, when I've been travelling overseas, I've been quite amazed at the lack of concern in some countries about food being brought in from other parts of the world without any check.
You mean people arriving into other countries don't have to declare any foodstuffs at all?
In some countries, there are lots of warnings about drugs and firearms, and there are usually limits on alcohol and tobacco, and perhaps perfume. But food's not mentioned.
Yes, I suppose I never thought about it till I came here. You can take anything you like into England as far as food is concerned.
You see, here, you can't even drive from one state to another with a few apples and oranges for the journey. There are signs to remind you not to bring any fruit into some states, though they don't usually search your bags unless there's a fruit fly epidemic or something.
With those kinds of regulations between states, it's no wonder that they're so strict about what you can bring in from overseas. Of course, farmers would be wiped out if some pests were introduced which destroyed their whole crop. It's easy to understand why you should take steps to prevent that.
And with food being such an important part of many cultures, it can be difficult for some people to realise they're not allowed to bring in delicacies from home for friends and relatives here. I'm defending someone at the moment who has exactly that problem.
Oh, what happened?
It's an interesting case. Have you got time for a cup of coffee? I'll tell you about it if you like.
That'd be great.
That is the end of part 4.
You now have half a minute to check your answers.